everyone, this video is going to talk about the show don't tell rule. You've probably heard this rule a lot in the past, but maybe you didn't particularly know it was being asked of you. So to help clarify this rule, we're going to talk about using descriptors and replacing adverbs. Now to use descriptions and replace adverbs correctly, we need to consider 7 considerations. So if you want to, go ahead and pause and read through this kind of table of contents, and then go ahead and move on. But I'm going to move on right now for the sake of time. So when you create descriptions, you probably go through 2 steps. You imagine the image, or actually find a photo of the image that you want to capture, and then you consider the perfect wording that could recreate such an image in your reader's mind's eye. 2 steps? That's so easy. But we know it's not easy because there's so many pitfalls that come along with description that we can fall into. And the first pitfall we're going to talk about is avoiding huge chunks of description. Now yes, description is incredibly important because it establishes context. It helps us with setting, the where, the when, the what of where the story is taking place. And it also sometimes creates tone so that we know how the narrator feels about what's being described. And all of this is incredibly important. But the problem is it can also be incredibly boring. And when something's boring, it's going to be skipped by the reader who wants action. So unless your readers are seeking out lyrically descriptive passages, they're not going to put up with pages and pages of description. So if you're hoping to write several pages of descriptions about, say, a mountain, know that your readers might get bored. And if you're going to write pages and pages in the details of the workings of a fireplace at a medieval castle, just know that your readers are going to get bored, and therefore they might skim, skip, or just stop reading altogether, which is not what you want. So instead of using huge chunks of description, what you want to do is make these descriptions part of the story. Now, think of it this way. Ignore the picture for a minute, and I want you to think about your room. When you walk into your room, hopefully or maybe possibly on a daily basis, I don't know how often you get there. You guys are very busy with extracurricular activities. But whenever you get back to your room, you walk in there and everything's the same, so you just go to your computer and you start working on your homework, or you just flop on your bed and you start listening to music. And you don't really look around because you're used to everything being exactly where it is. But if you walk in your room and something's moved or something's new is there, you're going to stop and you're going to look at it. And you're going to wonder, why is this here? Who's been in my room? This is an invasion of privacy. How could they? And therefore, you focus in on the object, and if this was a story, you would describe the object that is different. Because that's how people work. They notice things that are out of the ordinary. So let's take a look at this picture and say that it's the setting of our story. And we have a couple entering in this lobby, and maybe they're falling in love, they've had a great day, and they come and sit on the edge of this fountain, and they notice that this statue has been put in that's never been in the fountain before to make it look a little fancier, and they look up at the statue together. You can then describe this statue, and it can become a symbol of their new love. New statue, new love. And that gives you an opportunity to describe something important to the story. Note, it's also a symbol. When you describe something, it's always really great if you can make it worth even more to the story. Now see the couple is walking into the lobby and they're having a fight. Argue, and they bump into the bellhop, and they knock the bags off this little dolly thing. That gives you an opportunity to describe the bellhop, how he reacts, what he looks like, and also possibly something falls out of the bag and you can describe the contents strewn on the floor. What you're doing is you're allowing the description to develop as the plot develops. And maybe in the description of the bellhop, if you're writing a mystery, he comes into play later on with the mystery unfolding, or the contents that fell out of the bag are really important to the mystery. It's the idea that the description should be purposeful. That way it does not become boring. Now let's take a look at this example. It was dark, so dark she could only see the chair and the lamp, but could not see what was behind them. Here we have some description developing. We see the chair, we see the lamp. Great, it's dark. But what's really important here is that we know how she feels. We can tell that this character is scared, and that emotion is very important to making the description important. Now let's take a look at this second example. It's dark in the awful way that allows you to make out objects, but not the black spaces behind them. Now you might say, well, this one isn't as good as the previous one. It doesn't say as much. But that's actually a good thing. Yes, it doesn't have the chair and it doesn't have the lamp. But unless of those two objects end up being very important in the story, they seem to only distract from what is important, and that's the darkness, the thing causing the fear. So by eliminating them from the sentence, we now have more focus on the black spaces behind them, which is the thing causing the terror, and therefore it makes the sentence more impactful. Now the reader not only knows that the character is scared, but the reader themselves might feel scared because they're being engaged and asked to think about how they've feared dark spaces as well, making it a much more powerful description. So, bringing us to our next consideration, you want to make sure to describe what your characters would notice and consider their emotions. Ask, what does my protagonist feel as he or she sees, hears, senses, smells, tastes this? How are they feeling? Now, do not say what the emotion is. That's telling. We don't want to do that. Do not say they're happy. Do not say they're sad. You want to develop the emotion in the reader's mind's eye through your description. Just as the previous description created a sense of fear, you want to create a sense of emotion. Do not say they're scared. Develop it. Show. Alright, so that brings us to our next consideration, thinking about the types of words you use, because that's quite important. So let's look at this example that uses very specific details. Desi seemed the definition of a gentleman, a guy who could quote a great poet, order a rare scotch, and buy a woman that right piece of vintage jewelry. Across from him, I felt my suit wilt and my manners go clumsy. I had a swelling urge to discuss football and farts. It's a great alliteration right there, football and farts. But what's really important here is that it uses verbs and nouns. And verbs and nouns are our best friends because they are solid and they create vivid images. So we have poet, scotch, vintage jewelry, football, and farts. These nouns are things that we've encountered before. Maybe not scotch, you guys are too young. We've definitely encountered farts. And so it's the idea that you're familiar with these, and they create a very vivid description, a very vivid image of Desi, and also in juxtaposition, a very different vivid image of the narrator. And we can grab onto these things. What does not create vivid imagery are adverbs. Now, adverbs, let's first talk about what they are. So adverbs are a word that describes a verb, an adjective, or another adverb. She drives carefully. She's a very good driver. She drives really well. You'll notice that adverbs are expendable. They don't need to be there. She drives. She's a good driver. She just drives well. They're unnecessary words, and when you have unnecessary words, you have wordiness. So you're going to need to make sure they're very, very, very necessary. And carefully, very, and really are not necessary words because they're not specifying words like we intend. When we use an adverb, we think we're being even more descriptive and specific, but the word very and really isn't something that we can imagine in our head. It's an abstract word. And therefore, when we rely on modifiers to strengthen our description, we are building on a faulty foundation. Footballs and farts are not a faulty foundation because we can imagine those in our head. Very and really are faulty foundations because we cannot imagine them. Instead, what you want to do is find success in selecting the verb that perfectly portrays the image you're envisioning, or in the other case, using nouns that perfectly portrays the image you're envisioning. When you edit your work, you're going to spend considerable time scrutinizing your sentences to make sure the action maximizes full descriptive potential. Because yes, you're not going to write something perfectly your first time around. Therefore, getting rid of your adverbs is going to be something done through editing. So let's take a look at this example here. I ran quickly becomes I sprinted. Better verb use. They argued fiercely. Their ideas clashed. Better verb use. It creates a much more vivid image. Now, sometimes adverbs can be used pretty well. She carefully placed her fork on the plate, scared of what single scrape of metal against porcelain might elicit from her glowering mother. So here she carefully placed her fork on the plate, creates a pretty clear image. You might be able to use she gingerly placed to create a little more interesting vocabulary, but this works. One that I do really like is the second one. Where was Gabriel? Movie producers, left in 7 lurches, panicked expensively. So while expensively is a pretty awkward adverb, it's intentionally used in an awkward way here to create the sense of lurching. Left in 7 lurches, panicked expensively. Because of the word expensively being so awkward, it creates this lurching feeling as you read, and therefore mimics what's trying to be shown. And that is some crafty writing. Even though it's technically not the best grammatically, because of the artistic intent of it, it becomes an amazing sentence. So if you use adverbs, as I've said, make sure to use them wisely. Now let's take a look at adjectives and how they can also be dangerous and why we should not use them as much as maybe we do. So they arrived at the house just behind the streaming line of fire trucks, their street alive in the opulent glow of lights and sirens, their house ablaze in the perennial bloom of orange and yellow. That is a lot. Let's look at the second example. They arrived at the house just behind the fire trucks, the street alive in a glow of lights and sirens, their house ablaze. So here we can see the house and we can see the fire trucks. And the reason why the second one, yes, it doesn't have as many words, but it's more clear. And the reason why is because their house ablaze, the most important part of the sentence, is at the end. If you want to emphasize something in your sentence, you put it at the end of the sentence because that's what's going to stick with your readers. Here, their house ablaze is buried in the sentence itself, and it gets lost amongst the opulent glow and the perennial bloom of orange and yellow, which is a lot of information that doesn't really create a very good image. It's a little flowery, it's overdone, and it's kind of cliche. And that's not what we want. So make sure to not overuse adjectives just because you think it's going to make your writing fancy. So something that we do want to do is use all of the senses when we describe. But when you're doing that, make sure that you don't sacrifice diction for alliteration, rhythm, or other sound devices. Sometimes we get so caught up again in making our writing fancy, we sacrifice the words that we really should use. Diction always comes first. Also, don't get caught up in customary phrasing. We have cliches and turns of phrases that we're used to using, and as we write, we might get caught up in just kind of writing the way we always write when there's actually a better and more concise and vivid way to say it. Therefore, don't allow language to decide what you say. This is very time-consuming, but essentially what it's asking you for you to do is when you edit, you look at every sentence and you decide what is the best, most vivid, most kind of economical way to communicate this information to your readers. So for instance, Raymond Chandler said, "The things they remembered that haunted them was not, for example, that a man got killed, but that in the moment of death he was trying to pick up a paper clip up off the polished surface of a desk, and it kept slipping away from him, so that there was a look of strain on his face, and his mouth was half opened in a kind of tormented grin at the last thing in the world he thought about was death." So here, what's important is again the noun, the paper clip. And then, yeah, we have an adjective, polished, and then another noun, surface. So we're not using tons of adjectives, just a paper clip up off the polished surface, which is kind of a tongue twister. And it keeps slipping that verb away from him. So it's the idea that the moment, this detail of what he was doing when he got killed, is much more powerful than vividly describing the murder. So you have to find these little details that strike your readers. And there's something about this tiny little paperclip being the focus of such a momentous event in this man's life that's striking. And there's something disturbing about it. So you got to find those details, and they got to be original. Adjectives are not that original. We've used them all already. People have been using adjectives forever. You got to find those original uses of nouns and verbs that create striking images. So talking about striking images, metaphors are a really great way to create striking images, but sometimes we create really crummy metaphors, such as the overcast September sky, the overcast September sky stared back under a blanket of ashen gray. There's a lot going on. We have metaphor, we have personification, we have alliteration. It should be great, but it's not because it's so cliche. Blanket of ashen gray. Please do not compare snow or clouds to a blanket. It's been done so many times. Instead, you want to find original comparisons. There was an orange burn where the sun had been, and the mutilated animal shapes of clouds lay scattered in the tear of dusk. Much more original, okay? And again, sparing on the adjectives, just as many as you need, and focusing more on the verbs and nouns. And we're not going to talk about this because I'm almost out of time in my video. Alright, so that is it for our video. Review the considerations and keep in mind that you shouldn't get hung up on this during your first draft. Instead, make sure that you write your first draft and you go through and you edit for these items so that you can have the best piece of writing that you can possibly have. All right, thanks so much. Bye.